guys, welcome back to episode 8 of Putting the Truth Back into True Crime. In this episode, we're continuing on with Bryan Kohberger and how the courts forced him into taking a plea deal. I'm going to discuss the motion to continue and the court's response. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'm going to get straight into it. Thanks for tuning in. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. On the 20th of May 2025, Anne Taylor filed a 40-page motion to continue. In this, she highlighted a number of violations to Bryan Kohberger's constitutional rights. The entire document is playing in the background as I speak for anyone who would like to read it. She goes into detail, citing loads of different case law to back up her claim. It's important to note that Anne Taylor is one of very few attorneys who has the experience to handle death penalty cases in Idaho. I'm going to assume the woman knows what she's doing when it comes to her client's constitutional rights and using case law to, fight her case. Here's a quick summary. Bryan's defence insisted that they hadn't had enough time to go through all of the discovery. They explained that their team is much smaller than that of the state, who had multiple agencies assisting with their investigation. She insisted that in order for Bryan to have a fair defence, her team should be able to go through all of the necessary discovery. One of their main concerns was the terabytes of discovery they received a few months before trial. In the state's objection, they stated that they found no connection to Bryan on any of the devices and expected Bryan's defence just to take their word for it. It's important to remember that Anne Taylor's job isn't to prosecute Bryan, it's to find anything that will prove his innocence. Simply taking the state's word for it would be a blatant, ineffective assistance of counsel. She needed to analyse that data herself because whilst there may have been no connection to Bryan, there could have been evidence clearly pointing to someone else. That could then clear her client. Another main concern was that the trial was going to be held less than a month after the TV series were set to be aired and the books were set to be released, most of which altering the facts to make Bryan look guilty. They lied about so much information. They lied about Bryan being near the home. They lied about him claiming to be stargazing that night. They lied about things on his phone. They lied about the whereabouts of his phone. They lied about the amounts of DNA belonging to Bryan at the crime scene. They lied about Bryan being at the home 20 plus times prior to the murders. Bryan's team also expressed concern about someone leaking information to the media, etc. In the US, in most places, innocence is presumed until proven otherwise. Holding the trial so close would 100% taint the jury as much as it did the public perception. You guys know how much everyone thought Bryan was guilty. That's a very obvious breach of Bryan's rights. Not only did they lie about the case, there was a leak giving information to the public that had been fabricated in order to make Bryan seem more guilty. In the 40-page motion to continue, the defence also touched on the inability to carry out Bryan's background checks. If you read the document, it goes into a lot more detail as to why, but basically they hadn't had enough time to give a proper character analysis that would help the jury when it came to appropriate sentencing if and when he was found guilty. The defence also highlighted the importance of due diligence, especially in a death penalty case, and how clients' rights to a fair and complete defence is amplified in such cases, all of which she expressed very clearly that she didn't feel able to do. As his attorney, she was not happy that she would be able to take him to trial in August and defend him to the best of her ability. Now this is the most crazy part. Here is how the courts responded to this. The 40-page motion will still play in the background, but once that stops playing, that's when I'll put the screenshots showing this stuff. But I'm just going to read out what the courts have said anyway. Defendant argues a continuance is necessary for him to sufficiently review relevant discovery, conduct a full and complete investigation of mitigation evidence, particularly claimed newly revealed evidence that allegedly raises red flags, and remedy the prejudice caused by recent and upcoming inflammatory publicity and the alleged leak of information to the media. Moving forward with trial, he warns, will violate his rights under the United States and to Idaho Constitution, to due process, to be free from cruel and unusual punishment, to a fair trial, to effective assistance of counsel, to present a defence and confront witnesses, and to a fair and reliable sentencing determination. Absent from defendant's materials, however, is any good cause for the continuance or legitimate showing of prejudice should the trial proceed as scheduled. They said defendant has not demonstrated a continuance is warranted to review discovery. The court, however, rejected the same argument 2 months ago when defendant sought to strike the death penalty and impose discovery obligations upon the state. In its order, the court observed the utter lack of any proof supporting defendant's accusations of discovery violations by the state. More importantly, the court found defendant's complaints of being unable to meaningfully review discovery entirely unconvincing, pointing out that counsel struggled to articulate in any meaningful way the evidence, let alone relevant evidence, counsel had been unable to review over the past 2+ years, and why efforts to facilitate discovery review were not made long ago through this court and or the resource judge. This is absolutely disgusting, guys, because in the 2+ years they're talking about, the defence had made 24 separate requests for discovery through the courts. 24. Months prior, Anne Taylor also explained to the courts that when the state was handing over discovery, it was done so as if they had placed it in a snow shaker. That was the way she described it. It was making it impossible for them to go through it quickly. It was a timely process for the defence to organise the discovery before even having the opportunity to analyse it accordingly. She filed a motion asking the courts to prompt the state to hand over discovery in a more organised manner. The court denied the motion. There's no surprises there, but however, even a month after Anne filed the motion for continuance, she was still having to put in extra requests for discovery. The defence also had experts who testified under oath that the state were withholding certain data relating to the cell tower data and the testing of the DNA on the sheath and lack of paperwork on the process. Despite the 24 different requests for discovery and the motion to ask the defence to present discovery in a better manner, the court, and I quote, found defendant's complaints of being unable to meaningfully review discovery entirely unconvincing. He goes on to say, without more, the court can only conclude that defence counsel was using the volume of discovery measured in terabytes as a tactic to delay the proceedings at the 11th hour simply for the sake of delay rather than a legitimate threat of prejudice to defendant's substantial rights. The court goes into more detail in the background character information. For anyone who is interested in seeing and reading the order and the motion for themselves, reach out and I'll happily send you the link. Regarding the leak of information and the Dateline episode in the books that were due to be released a few weeks before the trial was set to start, the judge found that there was no need to continue based on those facts alone, as the case probably won't ever have less publicity, and that if they had moved venue, so that should have been enough to protect Bryan's rights to a jury pool that hasn't been tainted. He also exclaimed that the leak may have never been found, therefore continuing the trial on those grounds would mean that the case was held hostage. Held hostage until what? The court and the defence decided to do their jobs. Guys, again, I need to highlight that the information that was coming out in those books and documentaries was not only inflammatory, but it was false. There was so much information coming out that was making Bryan Kohberger look guilty, all of which has now been proven false. It's not as if it was legitimate information being released. This was purely inflammatory evidence that would 100% taint the jury as it did the public. The defence cites a case in which the defendant's sentence was reversed because of publicity and they found the courts didn't do enough to protect the defendant. Hippler feels that simply moving the court to another place in Idaho years before the leaks was enough to counteract the worldwide documentaries and books being released less than a month before trial, all of which containing nothing but blatant lies. The quote from the judge was this: "The trial cannot be held hostage indefinitely to the outcome of the investigation, particularly given the very significant chance the leakers may never be discovered. Thus, the court will not continue the trial pending the result of an investigation based on speculation that it will be successful in the hope that the impeachment evidence may be uncovered as a result. Order based on the foregoing, defendant's motion to continue is denied." Just like every other motion the defendant filed in this case. This, for me though, is the straw that broke the camel's back. The order was denied on the 26th of June 2025. and on the 30th of June, Bryan Kohberger signed the plea agreement. 4 days later, for 2.5 years, Bryan had maintained his innocence. In May, his defence explained in great detail how they were not ready to go ahead with the trial and felt unable to give Bryan a complete and just defence, which is his constitutional right, whether you believe he's guilty or not. Yes, the decision lies with the court and it was his call to make, but if you add everything together, the unknown male DNA that wasn't Bryan's, that was found all over the crime scene, the lack of ability to clearly identify the suspect vehicle, the fact that Bryan had no connection to any of the victims on any device, the fact that his phone was actually traced and located south of Pullman at 2:54 a.m. on the night of the murders and nowhere near Moscow. Despite the lead detective lying under oath and fabricating documents more than once, the court still denied a continuance. The court still denied the motion to force the state to give discovery in a more organised manner. The court still denied Bryan the ability to give alternate perpetrator evidence as a defence. The court still denied the defence expert the ability to testify to the state withholding cell tower data at trial. And ultimately, the court denied Bryan and his defence the ability to do just that, defend him. Bryan was therefore left with no option but to ask for a plea deal. Time and time again, Bryan was met with corruption in the courts. Judge Hippler knew about the unknown male blood all over the house and under the victim's nails. He knew it wasn't Bryan's. Judge Hippler knew that they couldn't identify the vehicle, much less prove it was Bryan Kohberger's vehicle or that he was driving it. Judge Hippler had every document and every lab report at his disposal. There is no legitimate reason as to why Judge Hippler didn't allow the continuance, other than he didn't want to allow the defence the time to properly investigate the discovery they were still having to request in June 2025. For what? For fear of what they may find. For fear that had they had enough time, they might actually be able to identify the real killers. If you've been tuning into this series, you'll know that the lab took one for the team and destroyed most of the DNA extracts of the unknown male DNA, if not all of it. You'll also know that Bill Thompson stopped the DNA testing on the items in the house, like the beer cans and the black backpack, etc., the results of which would have given us an idea of who was in the house that night and what events may have unfolded. At this point, I'm unsure where this leaves Bryan. With the DNA on the sheath being consumed during testing and most of the unknown male DNA, be it blood or DNA under the victim's nails, also being consumed during testing, all of which before Bryan was ever arrested, by the way. I'm unsure if the opportunity for post-conviction DNA testing is even still on the table. If it was, what would they test? With the state denying that they received all of the cell tower and handoff data and failing to give all of the data to the defence expert, they won't be able to prove Bryan's whereabouts. They can't go into the house and get more DNA samples because it's been torn down. They can't get a warrant for the cell tower data. They can't prove that Bryan wasn't the one driving that vehicle that night because the footage is so ambiguous. And that should work both ways. If they can't prove he wasn't driving, the state can't prove that he was. Now, is it just a coincidence that 4 days after they denied the motion to continue, that Bryan asked for a plea deal? I don't think so. You can let me know if you do in the comments. See you in the next episode. Bye.